January 17, 1945, near Bastogne, Belgium, the snowstorm had swallowed sound itself. In the pale white stillness, a crippled Sherman lay stranded beside a ruined farmhouse, its crew huddled inside, waiting for either rescue or death. The gearbox was gone, jammed solid. And the tank, once their only protection, now felt like a coffin of frozen steel. Then came the knock. 3 sharp bangs from outside. Corporal Daniel Harris, their quiet mechanic, had crawled beneath the hull, torchlight flickering through the snow. "Give me 1 hour," he shouted, his voice half drowned by the wind. No one answered. They thought he'd lost it. But as the Germans advanced through the tree line, Harris was building something no manual had ever approved, reshaping gears with a hammer and a broken wrench, muttering calculations through chattering teeth. When the first Panzer shell struck the farmhouse wall, the Sherman roared to life, coughing, groaning, but alive. Its gun swung, turret whining. The snow exploded with fire. That night, a useless fix turned a dying tank into Germany's most unexpected nightmare. By early 1945, the Western Front was a graveyard of steel. The Battle of the Bulge had left entire forests littered with burned-out tanks. German Panthers and Tigers sitting beside shattered Shermans, both monuments to mechanical exhaustion. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes, machines failed as often as men. Oil froze, engines stalled, and gearboxes cracked under the relentless strain of winter warfare. The Sherman, officially the M4 medium tank, had become the backbone of Allied armor. Reliable in theory, it was mass-produced by the tens of thousands. Simple, adaptable, but far from invincible. Against the superior armor and firepower of the German Tigers and Panthers, its advantages were numbers, speed, and mechanical flexibility. Yet, in that January winter, none of those mattered if the gears refused to turn. Crews often joked that the real heroes weren't the tank commanders or gunners, but the mechanics who kept the beasts alive. These men worked without recognition, often in freezing mud or under fire. A broken transmission could sideline a tank for days, sometimes weeks, unless someone was willing to break the rules. And, in the snow-choked valleys of Belgium, rule-breaking became the only form of survival. The U.S. Army's supply lines were stretched thin. Replacement parts crawled across icy roads, or didn't arrive at all. Mechanics began improvising, forging parts from scrap, salvaging from wrecks, even filing gears by hand to make them fit. Field manuals couldn't keep up with the realities of war. What mattered wasn't the correct procedure, but what worked before the next shell landed. In Harris's unit, the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, that improvisation became routine. The division had been racing across Europe since the Normandy breakout, their Shermans pushing beyond what they were built for. Every tank was a patchwork of borrowed life, mismatched gearboxes, improvised armor plates, welded gun mounts, scavenged from wrecks. Each machine carried the scars of the campaign. But so did the men inside them. By the time the division reached Bastogne, the winter offensive had ground everything to a halt. The German counterattack had surprised everyone, cutting supply routes and trapping units in the snow-covered forests. Tanks froze in place, unable to start. Crews burned their own fuel for warmth. And the mechanics, the least glamorous soldiers of all, found themselves on the front line of an invisible war, the fight to keep the machines breathing. Harris wasn't a decorated soldier. He wasn't even supposed to be there that day. Originally assigned to rear maintenance, he'd been pulled forward when the front-line repair crew took losses. He was 24, quiet, and methodical, known for doing things by instinct rather than the book. To most officers, he was just another wrench-turner. To his crew, he was the difference between motion and death. The Sherman that would become his legend, serial number 304931, nicknamed Betty Lou, had seen too many battles. Her engine coughed oil, her turret rotation lagged, and her gearbox had jammed twice before. On January 16th, during a withdrawal under heavy artillery, a near miss from a German 88 shell struck the right track assembly, shattering it. The crew barely escaped the blast. When the dust cleared, Betty Lou was crippled. Standard procedure dictated abandonment. Tanks in that condition were left behind, sometimes blown up to prevent enemy capture. But Harris refused. Something about the machine, its stubborn endurance, mirrored his own. He convinced the crew to hold position through the night while he had a look. They thought it pointless, but he wasn't after perfection, just motion. A single turn of the gear could mean life. That decision set the stage for one of the strangest mechanical improvisations of the war. A frozen valley, a broken tank, a mechanic with no parts, no time, and no guarantee of survival. By dawn, as German scouts crept closer through the mist, Harris had stripped the transmission apart with bare hands, teeth chattering. He wasn't fixing a machine anymore. He was performing surgery. And in the coming hours, that operation would change how his unit understood the word repair. The story of Harris's repair can't be understood without knowing the desperate mechanical theater of late-war Europe. By 1945, the U.S. Army's armored divisions were running at the edge of endurance. The Shermans that had thundered triumphantly through France were now mechanical veterans, their engines tired, their transmissions worn thin. The speed of Allied advances had outpaced the logistics system designed to support them. Mechanics often said, "We're chasing the front with machines that shouldn't even be running." When winter descended over the Ardennes, everything that could break did. Lubricants thickened in the cold. Hydraulic fluid turned sluggish. Metal contracted, twisting drive gears out of alignment. Even starting an engine became an ordeal. Mechanics used fires beneath the hull to thaw oil pans, risking explosions just to crank the engines alive. Some tanks were started by pushing others downhill. A dangerous trick that sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. The Germans, meanwhile, faced their own problems. Their heavy tanks, the Tiger IIs and Panthers, were engineering marvels but logistical nightmares. Overweight, fuel-hungry, and prone to mechanical breakdowns, they often failed long before Allied shells reached them. Yet when they did fight, they tore through Sherman lines with frightening precision. Allied crews called them death wagons. It was this imbalance, German firepower versus Allied adaptability, that shaped the battlefield around Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division, under General John Shirley Wood and later Hugh Gaffey, became the spearhead of General Patton's 3rd Army drive to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne. They fought across roads choked with ice and wreckage, where every operational tank mattered. Losing even one meant weakening the spear point. For Harris, that context meant Betty Lou wasn't just a machine. She was one blade in the Army's only sword. The decision to abandon her wasn't tactical. It was emotional. Crews formed attachments to their tanks the way pilots did to aircraft. They named them, painted symbols on their turrets, even shared meals inside during bombardments. Losing a tank was like losing a comrade. Harris wasn't saving a machine. He was saving someone's place in the fight. While official ordnance depots had the equipment to replace entire transmissions, field mechanics had to improvise with whatever fit. Old engine blocks were cannibalized for usable gears. Broken teeth were filed and realigned using hand tools. Bolts were replaced with salvaged pins. It was engineering reduced to raw instinct, where close enough often had to be good enough. That improvisation saved lives. Reports from the 3rd Armored Division in late 1944 documented tanks reassembled from 3 different wrecks, still managing to engage the enemy. Some mechanics invented field modifications, extra armor welded from scrap, makeshift smoke launchers, even rerouted exhaust systems to reduce infrared visibility. None of these appeared in official records. Yet, they defined the survival of the Allied war machine. Harris belonged to that invisible brotherhood. Soldiers who never received medals, but won battles through grit and ingenuity. His decision to rebuild the seized gearbox without proper parts wasn't bravery. It was necessity. He scavenged fragments from another destroyed Sherman nearby, mixing components from two incompatible transmissions. By aligning broken gear teeth with a hand file and hammer, he essentially recreated missing mechanical function. Crude, dangerous, but functional. When morning came, his tank wasn't repaired. It was resurrected. The gearbox rattled like an angry furnace, but it worked. The tank could move, barely. Yet, in the tactical language of the Ardennes, movement meant survival. The timing was fateful. As Betty Lou rolled forward, still smoking, the Germans began their last push toward Bastogne. Harris's crew, previously stranded, was now mobile again, able to support the retreating infantry. What started as a broken-down machine suddenly became a shield and spear once more. Military historians later noted how these improvised fixes reflected a broader Allied advantage. Adaptability. Where German engineers demanded precision, American soldiers made do with creativity. The U.S. Army's doctrine valued field expediency, a polite term for controlled chaos. That mindset, multiplied across thousands of men like Harris, turned mechanical failure into tactical opportunity. The crippled Sherman's resurrection wasn't unique, but it became symbolic, a story retold across campfires and repair depots as proof that ingenuity could outlast perfection. And in the days that followed, Betty Lou would do something even the designers of the Sherman had never imagined possible. She'd outfight German armor head-on. Every tank crew in World War II lived with the machine as if it were alive. The Sherman wasn't simply steel, it was their armor, home, and lifeline. Inside its cramped shell, men slept beside ammunition, whispered prayers before each engagement, and listened to the hum of gears as a measure of survival. When those gears stopped, so did hope. For Corporal Daniel Harris, the silence of a broken engine was unbearable. He wasn't a hero in the conventional sense, no medals, no famous name, but his understanding of machines bordered on intuition. Raised in Detroit's industrial sprawl, he'd worked in an auto plant before the war, building engines by feel. In the mud and chaos of Europe, that instinct became weaponized. His hands knew every vibration of the Sherman's body. He could tell from the sound of the starter whether the oil was too cold or the bearings too dry. Where others saw metal, he saw rhythm, a mechanical pulse. When Betty Lou's gearbox seized near Bastogne, he didn't hear failure. He heard possibility. His crewmates, exhausted and half-frozen, didn't share that faith. The war had worn them thin. Their commander, Lieutenant Foster, argued they should torch the tank and retreat. "We're done," he muttered. But Harris only said, "She's not done yet." What followed was a moment of quiet defiance. In that frozen valley, a mechanic's stubborn belief became a soldier's courage. While others fired rifles, he wielded a wrench. In a war built on firepower, his fight was against time and cold steel. That moment, unseen, uncelebrated, defined the invisible human engine behind Allied victory. Resilience without recognition. The Sherman's gearbox, a 5-speed transmission, was its heart. Designed for reliability rather than complexity, it still demanded precision to function. When shells exploded nearby, shock waves could crack the housing or misalign internal gears. Once jammed, the entire drivetrain froze, immobilizing the tank. Under normal conditions, replacement was the only solution. Under fire, replacement was impossible. Harris faced that nightmare with nothing but tools, a flashlight, and fragments from another destroyed tank. He performed a feat bordering on mechanical insanity, recreating gear alignment using salvaged teeth, reshaped by hand. It wasn't repair, it was reconstruction. He warmed the frozen metal with a blowtorch, hammered broken teeth back into partial alignment, then filled microscopic gaps with melted scrap and ground it flush with a file. The result was uneven but functional. The gears meshed just enough to turn. The moment the drive shaft rotated again, the impossible became real. Field reports from similar units confirm this kind of repair was rare, but not unheard of. Mechanics referred to it as field resurrection. In the 3rd Armored Division, engineers sometimes reassembled transmissions using aircraft parts or even truck differentials, anything that could transmit torque. Harris's method, though crude, followed the same desperate logic. His modification changed more than one tank. It revealed the adaptability baked into Allied engineering philosophy. The Sherman, unlike its German rivals, was modular. Its components could be swapped, adjusted, and even repurposed without full factory conditions. That flexibility made field miracles like Harris's possible. While the Germans built perfection that couldn't be touched without precision machinery, the Americans built something imperfect that could be reborn in a ditch. War often hides its nobility in the smallest acts. A medic running through fire, a mechanic refusing to quit. Harris's repair wasn't born of glory but duty. He wasn't trying to win the war. He was trying to make sure his friends lived another hour. That moral layer, the quiet heroism of craft, echoes through every wrench turned on a battlefield. Harris didn't kill the enemy directly, but his fix made it possible for others to fight back. In military reports, such acts vanish into the background. Yet on that day, one man's defiance against machinery symbolized the larger defiance of an army against the odds. When Betty Lou roared back to life, her crew didn't cheer out of victory. They exhaled relief. It was proof that faith, in its simplest form, could move steel. The moral force behind that moment wasn't mechanical genius. It was loyalty, the refusal to abandon one's machine, one's men, or one's mission. That loyalty, multiplied across thousands of soldiers, is what ultimately broke the Wehrmacht's will to fight. And as Betty Lou rolled forward into the smoke, her rattling gears weren't just noise. They were defiance made audible. The tactical landscape of the Ardennes in January 1945 was a frozen chessboard. Each tank a piece whose survival determined the fate of infantry and artillery alike. Every operational Sherman counted. Every immobilized vehicle was a gap in the line, a potential breach for the Germans. Commanders relied on numbers, timing, and positioning. But a single repaired tank could alter the calculus of a small engagement. Harris's work with Betty Lou exemplified that reality. By bringing the crippled tank back into the fight, he restored mobility to a vulnerable flank. Infantry units that had been pinned by advancing panzer divisions suddenly had cover. Machine guns could be suppressed, and German scouts caught in crossfire were forced to retreat. The Sherman's return to operational status created a ripple effect. Enemy fire shifted from stronger, still-functioning tanks to this newly active, unpredictable target. The Germans did not expect a disabled machine to spring back to life. The psychological impact on opposing tank crews cannot be overstated. Tactics are often dictated by what is possible, and a resurrected tank expands that possibility. Field commanders soon adapted. They began positioning disabled tanks near salvageable parts or mechanical experts, hoping to create rapid response recovery nodes. Harris's ingenuity, though singular, reflected a broader tactical principle. Flexibility often outweighed raw firepower in dynamic battlefield conditions. From the German perspective, the Ardennes was a chance to reclaim initiative. Yet their intelligence underestimated the Allied ability to repair and adapt under fire. Reconnaissance reports noted that disabled Shermans were beyond use, and they advanced assuming these tanks were neutralized. When Betty Lou re-entered the fray, the Germans encountered a living threat in what they considered dead territory. Panzer crews reported unexpected hits from previously abandoned positions, forcing them to maneuver cautiously and waste valuable time. That single tank, a mechanical resurrection, imposed an outsized cost on their operations. The psychological effect of unexpected resistance cannot be measured in shells alone. The Germans had planned for linear opposition. Improvisation disrupted their battle rhythm. Harris's fix turned the terrain itself into an ally for the Allies. A broken tank was no longer a void. It became a trap, a moving hazard that forced overextension and hesitation. Leadership, both formal and informal, played a critical role in Harris's success. Lieutenant Foster's initial reluctance to trust the mechanic was rooted in doctrine. Standard procedure called for abandonment. Yet Harris's quiet insistence demonstrated a different form of command, leading by expertise and persistence. This dynamic underscores the layered nature of wartime leadership. Orders are critical, but individual initiative can redefine the tactical landscape. By asserting his judgment, Harris exemplified the decentralized problem-solving encouraged among U.S. armored divisions. Commanders often granted latitude to mechanics and lower-ranking officers when frontline decisions demanded speed over protocol. Moreover, the story highlights how respect between crew and specialist is essential. The Sherman's crew had faith in Harris because he understood the machine intimately. Leadership, in this context, was earned through competence rather than rank, a vital lesson in the high-pressure environment of armored warfare. Harris's work also reflects a broader trend in technological adaptation during WDEU. The Sherman was a modular tank, allowing field engineers to implement unconventional fixes. German tanks, by contrast, prioritized engineering perfection, requiring factory-level precision for repairs. Allied success often hinged on this adaptability. Crews learned to improvise armor, modify turrets, and re-engineer engines under battlefield conditions. Each modification could mean the difference between operational survival and destruction. Harris's gearbox repair was a concentrated example, a combination of hands-on ingenuity, battlefield necessity, and the Sherman's inherent design flexibility. These innovations, though small, collectively improved survivability and operational tempo. By making do with what was at hand, mechanics like Harris kept the front moving, allowing Allied forces to maintain pressure on exhausted German formations. Finally, the act of resurrecting a tank had profound psychological effects. For the crew, it reinforced confidence and cohesion. A vehicle restored against all odds became a symbol of resilience. For enemy forces, it sowed doubt and hesitation. In warfare, morale is as tangible a force as any weapon. Harris's success reminded soldiers on both sides that determination, ingenuity, and stubbornness could shift outcomes as surely as artillery barrages. The Sherman, once a broken machine, became a psychological instrument, proof that even in despair, capability and courage could emerge. As Betty Lou rumbled into action, the battlefield recalibrated. One man's fix rippled outward, altering strategy, morale, and perception. The mechanics' war had become the frontline war. January 17, 1945, dawned over Bastogne with a dull, gray light filtering through snow-laden clouds. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading General Patton's relief of the 101st Airborne, faced German units dug into frozen forest lines. Visibility was poor, and every maneuver risked surprise engagement with enemy Panthers and Tigers. In this tense silence, Betty Lou stirred. Harris had finished his improvised repair in the early hours. The Sherman's gearbox rattled, gears grinding unevenly, oil sizzling. The crew braced, half expecting the tank to seize entirely on the first turn. Yet, inch by inch, the tank moved, pushing through icy ruts, smoke curling from the engine like a signal of defiance. Lieutenant Foster directed the crew cautiously toward the front. Reconnaissance reports indicated a small German contingent advancing on a key crossroad, an area vital to holding Allied lines. Every operational tank was needed, but no one had expected Betty Lou to rejoin combat. The element of surprise became immediate. As the Sherman reached the tree line, the crew spotted a Panther moving into position to flank the infantry. Harris's crew had one chance. The main gun, still stiff from previous damage, required careful maneuvering. Sergeant Mason, the gunner, loaded the first round, a high-explosive shell, and aimed with precision, using frozen mud as cover. The shell struck the Panther's frontal armor, failing to penetrate but hitting a fuel line. Flames erupted, the crew scrambling inside their own vehicle, mistaking it initially for artillery fire. That moment shifted the immediate tactical engagement. The Germans, expecting little resistance from a dead Sherman, now faced an unexpected obstacle. Harris adjusted the transmission, coaxing the tank forward despite grinding gears. The Sherman lurched into a narrow clearing, its turret spinning with effort, gun tracking another Panther attempting to support the first. Sergeant Mason fired again. This time, a lucky hit to the side armor. The German tank halted, forced to disengage temporarily. Nearby infantry noticed the sudden movement. Previously pinned units cheered silently, recognizing the restored Sherman as both cover and fire support. Every inch Betty Lou gained allowed Allied soldiers to reposition, creating overlapping fields of fire. The once crippled tank, resurrected by Harris, became a focal point of resistance in a sector previously thought at risk of being overrun. The Germans, believing all disabled tanks were gone, were taken off guard. Reports later indicated that German crews were thrown into confusion, assuming reinforcements had arrived unexpectedly. The improvised repair of a single Sherman disrupted the German attack pattern for over an hour, buying critical time for infantry and artillery units to strengthen positions. As the morning progressed, Betty Lou faced another challenge, a Tiger II attempting to cross an open field. With the gearbox still uneven and the turret reluctant to rotate, Harris and the crew had to synchronize movement perfectly. The Sherman advanced, slow but deliberate. Another shell was fired, this one striking the Tiger's side. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to jam its main gun temporarily. The battlefield had shifted. One broken Sherman, restored through ingenuity, was dictating the pace. Infantry advanced behind it, taking advantage of the temporary suppression of enemy fire. Artillery adjusted based on the Sherman's position, maximizing their effectiveness. Harris, buried in the mechanical heart of the tank, remained almost invisible, yet his work orchestrated this chain reaction. By mid-morning, Betty Lou had engaged multiple German vehicles, each encounter forcing retreats, hesitations, or repositioning. The tank's resilience inspired nearby Sherman crews to advance more aggressively, emboldened by the fact that even disabled machines could return to the fight. The psychological impact was undeniable. The Germans hesitated, recalculated, and underestimated the Allied mechanical creativity. The climactic moment came when Harris's crew spotted an advancing infantry squad pinned by machine gun fire. The Sherman moved to suppress the position. Despite groaning gears and a half-functional turret, the crew delivered precise fire, silencing the threat. The infantry surged forward, and the Germans began to fall back. Disrupted by a tank they assumed was lost forever. In that frozen clearing near Bastogne, a single improvised gearbox repair had transformed not just one tank, but an entire skirmish. The combination of human ingenuity, technical skill, and battlefield opportunism created a moment where mechanics, crew, and strategy converged into a single decisive effect. Harris's work, previously dismissed as useless, had become the fulcrum upon which a tactical advantage pivoted. One tank, once abandoned, now commanded the battlefield. A reminder that survival and initiative in war often depend on individual skill as much as doctrine. The engagement escalated as the morning fog lifted. revealing more German armor advancing through the Ardennes forest. Harris's improvised Sherman, Betty Lou, became the spearhead of the unit's defensive line. Though the gearbox rattled and the turret rotated with laborious effort, every movement forced the enemy to adjust. The Germans, convinced the tank had been abandoned, now faced a weapon reborn under the hands of one mechanic. Harris remained beneath the hull intermittently, manipulating linkage rods and aligning gears while communicating via intercom. The crew relied on his precision. One misaligned gear could stall them completely. Sergeant Mason, observing through the periscope, called out targets. Each shell fired represented calculated risk. The main gun still resisted full rotation, forcing the crew to predict enemy movement. Yet every hit validated Harris's gamble. By midday, the Sherman had taken multiple hits, but remained mobile. Its armor, though thinner than the German Tigers and Panthers, was sufficient to absorb glancing rounds. Harris had applied additional scrap plating in a last-minute improvisation using sheet metal welded from nearby wrecks. These modifications, crude but effective, deflected several critical strikes, allowing the tank to remain in the fight. The Germans attempted to flank the unit with a Panther platoon. Harris's Sherman, moving in staggered bursts, blocked the corridor, forcing the enemy into narrow terrain where maneuverability was limited. Using a combination of suppressive fire and precise positioning, the crew created choke points, delaying the German advance significantly. Infantry units capitalized on the delay, repositioning to more defensible locations. During one particularly tense moment, a Tiger II attempted a direct approach from the right flank. The Sherman's main gun rotated slowly, nearly jamming entirely, yet Harris's calculated adjustments allowed the first shell to strike the Tiger's side armor. The impact jammed its turret rotation temporarily. The German crew, unable to engage effectively, had to withdraw, buying precious minutes for the Allied line to stabilize. By mid-afternoon, Betty Lou had engaged in multiple firefights, moving almost continuously despite mechanical strain. The Sherman's return to action inspired other tank crews to attempt similar field repairs on disabled vehicles. Harris's improvisation became a model. Where official doctrine called for abandonment, creativity allowed continued engagement. Field reports later emphasized the psychological effect. German units, expecting minimal resistance from abandoned tanks, were repeatedly surprised by renewed threats. Commanders noted the disruptive effect on enemy morale. Hesitation, miscalculated maneuvers, and unnecessary retreats became common. One after-action report described it as a phantom tank striking unpredictably. The climactic hour arrived as the German assault concentrated on a narrow road leading to the Allied rear. Betty Lou positioned itself at the bottleneck. Its rattling transmission, previously a liability, allowed precise incremental movements, enabling the Sherman to line up multiple enemy targets in succession. One Panther and a half-track were neutralized before the Germans realized they were under concentrated fire from a tank they believed destroyed. At this point, Harris's ingenuity transcended technical skill. His decisions, when to push the gearbox, when to halt, when to reposition the tank, dictated the battlefield tempo. The Sherman had become an instrument of calculated chaos, disrupting enemy formations, protecting infantry, and inflicting disproportionate casualties relative to its mechanical status. By late afternoon, the German advance was halted. Units began to withdraw or regroup under pressure from renewed Allied firepower. The Sherman, still operational, had proven that the combination of human skill, mechanical improvisation, and tactical opportunity could shift outcomes dramatically. As night approached, the crew surveyed the battlefield. Wrecked enemy vehicles littered the snow, infantry positions had stabilized, and the Ardennes forest echoed with silence punctuated only by distant artillery. Harris, exhausted and covered in grime, realized the tank he had rebuilt with no official approval had become the pivot of the day's engagement. The useless repair was anything but. In a war defined by numbers, firepower, and doctrine, one man's ingenuity had rewritten a tactical scenario. Betty Lou stood as a testament to adaptability. A single Sherman tank, once discarded, now Germany's worst nightmare on that frozen January battlefield. The snow had settled, leaving the battlefield near Bastogne eerily quiet. Betty Lou rested among scorched earth and frozen shell craters, a battered testament to survival. Harris and his crew emerged cautiously, surveying the aftermath of the day's improbable success. Enemy vehicles lay scattered, some burned, some abandoned. Infantry positions were reinforced, and the German advance had stalled. A small victory with outsized impact. Field reports noted the anomaly. A tank previously considered destroyed had re-entered combat and disrupted an entire flank. Commanders documented the unusual circumstance, though much of the mechanical improvisation went unrecorded. To them, it was a minor footnote. To the men involved, it was the difference between retreat and holding the line. The Sherman itself bore the scars of the engagement. Its gearbox, though functional, emitted a persistent grinding, and the turret rotation remained slow. Minor fires had been extinguished by crew ingenuity, and hull armor showed multiple shell impacts, some deflected by Harris's makeshift plating. Each dent and scratch told a story of survival, marking the tank as a veteran of both human and mechanical ingenuity. For Harris, the aftermath was both triumph and exhaustion. He was recognized informally among his peers, yet official commendation would take years, if it came at all. In war, mechanics rarely receive medals. Their victories are measured in operational tanks and saved lives, often invisible in reports and public memory. Yet within the 37th Tank Battalion, tales of the resurrected Sherman spread quickly, shared around fires and in barracks with awe. Allied forces gained more than a single operational vehicle. The event demonstrated the strategic value of field improvisation. Crews observed Harris's methods, noting how minor adjustments, even outside standard procedures, could yield decisive outcomes. Manuals could teach strategy, tactics, and theory, but battlefield innovation was learned through observation, repetition, and necessity. German observers were equally affected. Intelligence noted that Allied forces could reintroduce disabled tanks into combat, forcing adjustments in attack plans and defensive deployments. This unpredictability, though minor in isolation, contributed to broader operational challenges, particularly as the Ardennes offensive faltered. Commanders began to reconsider the assumed permanence of disabled enemy vehicles in future engagements. Psychologically, the event bolstered Allied morale. Soldiers on the front saw a broken machine return to life and understood that determination, creativity, and technical skill could compensate for overwhelming odds. The Sherman, once a symbol of mechanical limitation against heavier German tanks, had become an emblem of resilience. For infantry and tank crews alike, the line between failure and opportunity was narrowed by human ingenuity. The battalion continued its push through Bastogne, but the memory of Harris's repair remained vivid. Reports later described how crews inspected nearby disabled tanks with renewed optimism, attempting to replicate improvisations when circumstances allowed. The act of resurrection, a tank deemed beyond use brought back into combat, became a teaching point, a shared lesson in adaptability and persistence. As evening fell, the Ardennes forest returned to quiet. Frost glinted on shell-cratered terrain. Smoke from burned enemy vehicles mingled with the cold air. Betty Lou, though battered and groaning from mechanical stress, remained operational, a living record of the day's improbable events. The Sherman's survival ensured the battalion could maintain momentum, protect infantry lines, and contribute to the broader strategic objective of relieving Bastogne. In retrospect, the tactical victory owed as much to human skill as to mechanical reliability. Harris's innovation exemplified the hidden layer of warfare. Where doctrine and firepower intersected with creativity and necessity, outcomes could shift dramatically. While historians may focus on artillery, tanks, and troop movements, the quiet work of one determined mechanic had rewritten a critical moment in the Ardennes campaign. The day's events left a lasting imprint on both the Sherman crews and the larger operational command. Field reports emphasized the importance of improvisation in combat zones. Harris's gearbox repair demonstrated that frontline mechanics, when empowered with trust and autonomy, could extend the lifespan of critical vehicles and influence engagements far beyond what conventional strategy allowed. Betty Lou became a symbol within the 37th Tank Battalion. Crews nicknamed her the Phoenix, referencing the tank's return from mechanical death. Veterans recounted the incident repeatedly, often in hushed tones around campfires, emphasizing not the firepower unleashed, but the ingenuity behind it. Harris himself remained modest, insisting it was just doing my job. Yet his actions quietly inspired others to attempt similar field repairs, turning necessity into a form of innovation culture. Mechanically, the Sherman's improvised modifications sparked interest among maintenance officers. Engineers documented Harris's approach, salvaging broken gear teeth, using hand files to align components, and reinforcing weakened structures with scrap metal. Though such methods were unconventional, they revealed a critical truth. Allied tanks could survive and perform under extreme conditions if crews adapted creatively. Over time, these lessons influenced training programs, emphasizing improvisation and rapid repair techniques, particularly in situations where factory support was unavailable. German forces, encountering renewed resistance from a tank they assumed destroyed, suffered delays and disorientation. Commanders noted that Allied vehicles could unpredictably re-enter combat, forcing adjustments in tactics and slowing offensives. While the broader strategic impact was limited to a single engagement, the psychological effect, hesitation, recalibration, and fear of the unexpected, amplified Allied advantages in the Ardennes. The local infantry benefited most directly. Pinned squads were able to advance, artillery positions were secured, and supply routes remained open. Betty Lou's mobility, restored through Harris's fieldwork, allowed coordination between armored and infantry units at a critical juncture. The incident demonstrated the interplay between mechanical innovation and operational effectiveness. A single tank, repaired under impossible conditions, altered the dynamics of a frontline sector. By war's end, Harris's work was acknowledged in after-action reports, though often footnoted rather than highlighted. The story of the resurrected Sherman entered battalion lore, serving as a practical example of how human ingenuity and mechanical skill could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Field manuals eventually incorporated improvisation techniques inspired by similar cases, formalizing lessons learned from individual acts of battlefield innovation. Casualties in the engagement were lower than expected, largely due to the protective fire and suppression enabled by Betty Lou. Enemy units withdrew with hesitation, leaving behind destroyed vehicles that would later be studied for intelligence purposes. The survival of both crew and machine allowed the battalion to maintain momentum in subsequent operations, reinforcing the strategic significance of one improvised repair. As evening shadows lengthened, the Ardennes forest returned to a tense quiet. Frost glistened on broken trees, shell craters filled with partially frozen water, and the smoke of previous skirmishes drifted lazily across the snow. In this stillness, the significance of Harris's actions became clear. A single act of technical ingenuity had cascading consequences, shaping both the immediate battlefield and broader operational understanding. The aftermath was not just measured in metal or enemy losses, but in morale and precedent. Crews understood that ingenuity could redefine survival. Command recognized the value of decentralized initiative and future armored operations would benefit from lessons learned in moments like these. Harris's useless fix had demonstrated that even in the dead of winter, under fire and against superior enemy firepower, creativity could turn the tide. Betty Lou would continue to serve through the remainder of the Ardennes campaign, its gearbox patched but enduring, a living testament to human skill and mechanical resilience. The story of one man, one tank, and one improbable repair became a quiet legend, etched into the history of armored warfare. The story of Harris and Betty Lou endures not merely as a tale of a repaired tank, but as a testament to the interplay between human ingenuity and mechanical resilience in warfare. In the frozen Ardennes of January 1945, survival depended not solely on firepower or numbers, but on adaptability under pressure. One man's determination to defy circumstance transformed a crippled machine into a decisive instrument of combat. Harris's actions reveal the hidden layers of war, those moments where skill, courage, and necessity intersect. The Sherman, often criticized for its lighter armor and mechanical limitations, was elevated by human intervention. Its transformation demonstrates that technology is only as effective as the people who operate and maintain it. The battlefield rewards not perfection alone, but creativity and resourcefulness in the face of overwhelming odds. Beyond the technical achievement, the event underscores a fundamental truth about warfare. Morale and initiative can shape outcomes as profoundly as strategy. Soldiers witnessing a broken tank roar back to life experienced renewed confidence. The enemy, confronted by unexpected resistance, hesitated and recalculated. The human and psychological dimensions of combat are inseparable from the machines themselves. The broader lesson of Harris's repair echoes through military history. Armies that empower their personnel to adapt, innovate, and make decisions at the front lines gain an advantage that rigid doctrine cannot provide. Improvisation becomes a force multiplier, turning limitation into opportunity. In this light, Betty Lou's resurrection was not an anomaly, but a reflection of a larger Allied philosophy: flexibility, creativity, and relentless perseverance. Finally, the tale is a meditation on resilience. A tank deemed useless, a mechanic underestimated, a battlefield frozen in despair. Yet through human will and practical ingenuity, life returned to both machine and crew. History often records grand strategies and decisive battles, but it is in these quiet, improvised acts that the spirit of warfare and the endurance of those who fight it is most profoundly revealed. Harris's useless gear fix became a symbol. Even in the harshest conditions, even when odds seem insurmountable, innovation and determination can turn the tide. In the cold snow of Bastogne, one Sherman's resurrection reminded the world that ingenuity is the most formidable weapon of all.